Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another episode of Time Warp for you. This is a series where we talk about stuff that's been removed from the game for one reason or another. The winner of this month's Patreon poll is Wrath of the Lich King rating, so that's what we'll be doing today. This is part 3 of my coverage of the rating in the game and how it's progressed over the years. In part 1, we talked about vanilla and the 40-man rating and some of the nuances surrounding that, and in part 2 we talked about the decrease in size to 25, some of the hardcore attuning, the difficulty level in general, so we've already seen some sweeping changes in just one expansion.
Closing in around you. The last justice has been awakened. The sins of the past have finally caught up
to you. So, this brings us to the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, which brought a ton of changes itself. We of course have another reduction in player size, although optional this time. In the Burning Crusade, we had Karazhan and Sol Amon as 10-man, so they experimented with the idea a bit before taking it a step further in Wrath. There definitely was an audience for that smaller raiding experience, something in between dungeons and the big 25-mans where you could have a more tight-knit group of friends take on the tougher content. So, the way they handled it in Wrath was, for every normal 25-man raid, there was also a 10-man mode that you could do. Now, the loot wasn't as good, if I recall correctly, but it still satisfied that audience of wanting a less hardcore raiding experience without being locked out of most of the raids like they were in the Burning Crusade. The difficulty was still there, although it was slightly easier overall compared to their 25-man counterparts, I think. And something to note was that back then you could do both 10 and 25-man raids in 1 week. They had separate lockouts, so this lets you gear up a lot quicker, but it also introduced a lot of burnout, which I think some people bring up as an issue today because, you know, we have LFR, normal, heroic, and mythic difficulties, so you can clear a raid up to 4 times a week, which with the Titan forging system in Legion, it puts a lot of strain on the player clearing the same content over and over. I don't think it was as bad in Wrath since it was just 2 player sizes at the end of the day, which wasn't too bad, especially considering that we just got out of the Burning Crusade, which again was a very hardcore and time-consuming expansion in terms of raiding. In general, I think most people would agree that the overall difficulty of the raids in the Wrath of the Lich King kind of took a step down. You didn't have bosses that were literally impossible to kill until a certain patch, at least that I recall anyways. It was a more laid-back experience that started opening up the floodgates to more casual players, as evidenced by the new difficulty setting. Just like how the Burning Crusade got heroic mode for dungeons, Wrath got heroic modes for raids, and this is where it was more comparable to the difficulty of the Burning Crusade raiding scene. You had heroic modes for both 10 and 25 men, and to unlock them, you had to first finish the normal version of that raid. 10 man for 10 man heroic, and 25 man for 25 man heroic. And they're of course a harder version of the raid overall. The bosses had more HP, they hit harder, and there were some mechanic differences which varied from boss to boss, and this is where the hardcore crowd would thrive. It's actually a really huge change for the game because up until this point with Vanilla and the Burning Crusade, it was a huge time investment to become geared enough and skilled enough to go through these raids. If you couldn't kill a boss, you didn't have the choice of switching to a lower difficulty, either by going down to 10 man to get the mechanics down, to normal mode, or later in Cataclysm, LFR mode with Dragon Soul. And because of this, like I mentioned in the BC video, Many people see the Burning Crusade as the end of that true hardcore experience. Just one path to the finish. Dedication, lots of time, coordination and skill, and maybe a bit of luck. But switching back to Wrath here, even putting the heroic mode aside, you also had the option of hard modes here and there as well. The Flame Leviathan and Ulduar, where you don't take out the towers, Yogg Saron with no help from the Keepers, the Mimir hard mode where you press the button, hard mode Sartharion, and so on. The difficulty was very much in your control, and you could make things easier or harder as you please. And I think this was a big improvement in the raiding scene in general, is that control aspect. The heroic mode wasn't in Wrath at first though. For the first two big raids, which was Naxxramas and Ulduar, your two choices were just 10 or 25 man. It wasn't until patch 3.2 was when heroic mode was released, along with the new trial of the Crusader raid. Then of course they had it for the Icecrown Citadel, and lastly the Ruby Sanctum, which was the final raid for the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. And something big to note, especially coming from BC, is attuning. In the Burning Crusade, as I mentioned in the previous video, the attuning was insane. You had quest lines that led to dungeons, that led to rep farming, that led to heroic dungeons, that led to more quests, raids, and so on. Well, in Wrath, guess how much attuning you had to do? 0. There was no attuning in the Wrath expansion. Quite the change in speed, huh? Well, some might count that having to complete a raid in normal mode to unlock heroic is attuning, but at least to zone into the normal raids, you just had to zone into the normal raids, that was it. And it's a pretty dividing thing. Some people love attuning and some people hate it. Personally, I like a little attuning. Not as much as the Burning Crusade, but still for me, it's fun to have multiple things to do endgame, aside from just killing bosses and getting loot. As for the actual raids themselves, they were phenomenal for the most part in my opinion. The Wrath of the Lich King was my favorite expansion, mainly because of the raids, with Ulduar being my all-time favorite even to this day. I think the main reason for that is the actual mechanics of the bosses. In vanilla, understandably, we started pretty simple. I mean, you would have bosses that were straight carbon copies of each other, aside from just like one ability. You had the Mind Control Flamewalker, the Rain of Fire Flamewalker, the Arcane Explosion Flamewalker, and the You Came to the Wrong Neighborhood Flamewalker. By the way, that's a good name for them, right? Flamewalkers. Despite the fact that they don't have any legs, but whatever. The point is that, mechanics-wise, there wasn't much there. Now, admittedly, this is a pretty unfair example, seeing as how the Molten Core was the first raid in vanilla, and it did improve in future raids, but still, you could tell that it was still the growing stage. It was improved a bit in the Burning Crusade though. Multi-phase boss fights, some mechanics here and there, but in my opinion, the bound from the Burning Crusade to Wrath was way bigger than vanilla to the Burning Crusade. Specifically, Ulduar and onwards. You had siege-based fights with vehicles, nicely done multi-phase fights. It was a good variety, and each fight truly felt like there was a new and unique challenge that she had to conquer. The settings were also pretty unique, just like the Burning Crusade. You had the re-release of Naxxramas as our first raid, as I mentioned earlier. The reason why they did this was because only like 1% of the player base actually got to see the full raid back then. This was due to the extreme challenge of the raid back in vanilla, combined with the fact that shortly after its release, they announced the Burning Crusade expansion. It was common knowledge that we would get a new level cap, and all the gear in this place would become useless by the time we hit 70. So it killed all motivation basically, and no one wanted to grind their skull against the wall for gear that they're going to replace in a few months. So, It came back with the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, with a few twists and tweaks here and there. It wasn't just a copy-paste. Story-wise, we actually killed Kel'Thuzad in vanilla, put his soul into a phylactery, and we gave it to Father Inigo Montoy in the Light's Hope Chapel in the Eastern Plaguelands. It was to be destroyed, but it never reached the Argent Dawn. Inigo betrayed us and reincarnated Kel'Thuzad for his return in Northrend, where he now serves the Lich King. Thus, Naxxramas 2.0. It was a nice introduction into the Lich King's army of undead, including Death Knights, which was of course a new player class as well.
A hero. That's what you once were. You stood boldly against the shadow and purchased another dawn for the world with your life.
I don't have much to say about them since I wanted to focus more on raiding, but I guess a big thing to point out was how broken they were at first. So there was some balancing issues, and it did have an effect on the raiding scene, despite what the developers told you.
Ultimately, the Death Knight needs to be balanced against all the other classes that we have in the game. We've very deliberately set it up so that it's not more powerful than other character classes. Otherwise, what we'd see is every kind of veteran player playing a Death Knight.
That's bullcorn. They could tank, deal monster damage, and heal themselves like crazy, which made them a force to be reckoned with in both PvP and in raiding. For the smaller raids, we had the Vault of Arkavan, which was interesting because it was locked behind the Wintergrasp PvP zone. This was sort of an open world PvP area where every few hours you could fight for control over a base, and if your side controlled it, you got access to this raid that held a few bosses that dropped both tier sets and PvP pieces. Kind of an interesting raid, and it would be emulated again in the Cataclysm expansion with Tol Barad. And just to name them off really quickly here since I started anyways, we had another re-release, this time with Onyxia. Not much to say there, I covered her in the vanilla raiding episode. We also had the Obsidian Sanctum, which was another single boss raid, the Eye of Eternity, where we take on the insane Malagos, and while I'm mentioning single boss raids, the Ruby Sanctum, which was the last raid added for Wrath. And continuing with the big raids here, we also had the Trial of the Crusader, as I mentioned earlier. Again, this was the first heroic mode raid, and this one was pretty unique because for the whole raid, minus the final boss, you were in just one room. A pretty easy one for the art team, that's for sure. You weren't taking down an evil being that's about to destroy the world. This is just for fun apparently. Well, until the end at least, when things take an unexpected turn. Before that though, we had the Oberoi Raid, and this one just blew me away. It opened up with a vehicle siege assault on the Flame Leviathan boss, where you took motorcycles, demolishers, and tanks to try and take them down. It had 14 bosses total, all totally different from each other, including the Keepers, Mimiron, Freya, Thorum, and Hodir, and even capping it off with the old god Yogg-Saron. And even the optional Algalon the Observer boss, if you wanted a real challenge. You had a bunch of hard modes, as I mentioned earlier. The setting was just awesome, it was rich in story, and to me, it's a perfect raid that I spent just a ton of time in. And that's another quick thing to bring up is the story, which I also think really started to ramp up in this expansion. We even got cutscenes, which, as I remember, was new. The expansion was of course about Arthas Menethil and his rise, or fall rather, to the Lich King. He had a presence through questing, dungeons, and the raids, and it all slowly built up, of course climaxing in the Icecrown Citadel, which was the final big raid. Again, just a really well done raid with tons of variety, great bosses, a legendary, great mechanics, storytelling, and a great finish. I don't want to go too much into detail with each particular raid because it's not the point of the video. Maybe I'll do a proper tribute to it in my Evolution series. Again, just like the previous ones, I wanted to focus more on stuff like heroic mode, the different player sizes, hard modes, the mechanics and changes surrounding raiding, rather than the raids themselves. So, aside from all of that, you also had the class balance. Now, as I always say, it's never perfect, and the Death Knights in particular were very questionable. But I think just as how the Burning Crusade had big improvements over vanilla, Wrath had big improvements over BC. And I'm talking raiding here, by the way, not PvP. There's always a best for everything, that's just the way it is. If I recall correctly, Paladins and Death Knights were, quote, the best tanks, Druids and Priests were up there as healers, and DPS I want to say was fairly close. It's kind of hard to determine that though because of the Shadowmourne legendary. Do you count that in the class balance? If so, you are going to have two-hander classes at the top no matter what. But I don't remember any classes that were completely useless or stupidly broken, aside from maybe the Death Knights, depending on your definition of broken. It felt like they all brought something to the table, unlike the balanced druids in vanilla who were just... Anyways, moving on. So, the Wrath of the Lich King. 10 and 25-man raiding, now fully integrated with every raid, heroic mode, hard modes, the focus on the story. Tons of changes in this one, just like every expansion, but for me, this was the sweet spot. And according to the subscription numbers, I think a lot of people agree with that. Again, it's just all my opinion, but I thought the raids were amazing. The difficulty and how you could control it was a big improvement, I think. If you ran into a boss that you just couldn't kill, you had some options. Your raid didn't stop there for the next 2 weeks. But at the same time, it wasn't so easy like LFR mode, where you can just roll your face on your keyboard. It was a great expansion in many different aspects, raiding being one of them. But, as you'll see in the next part, no king rules forever.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.